Well, welcome, and Baruch Ata Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Asher Kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'asok b'divrei Torah. So,
Amen.
thank you. And before we begin today, I'm telling you that this is a genuinely R-rated lesson, and that is because Judaism, when it says love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. The word for heart is levavcha, not libcha, but levavcha. And there's a traditional interpretation that means both with your good side and with your dark side. And we are going to be looking at the dark side today. And it doesn't make me feel the most comfortable, obviously. When I was reading, I think it was Cider House Rules, there's an entry that the doctor puts in there where he says, they've reached the teenage years and now you start to keep secrets. So these are human behaviors. That's what they're dealing with. And we look at it from a clinical point of view. And just as in clinical world, you have to deal with every element of human behavior and what goes on. And we know, of course, that when it comes to sexuality, that is a very deep, deep, deep part of human behavior. So I'm going to see what I can do to find the share with you. And this morning, we are going to be looking, of course, at Torah Tmima. And I trust that you have a nice size copy in front of you. You do? That it's a good size and you can see it clearly. And this is the verse that we read on chapter 2, verse 24 in Genesis. And it says, Al ken ya'azov ish et aviv et mo. And for this reason, a man leaves his father and his mother. I need to tell you that we have already read an interpretation that moves away from let's say, the obvious one about leaving their jurisdiction, and that it's really talking about the fact we're talking about marital relations. That's what that Ya'azov Ish has to do with a new intimate relationship with his wife. And here we go. This is the part that we're really looking at, V'davak be'ishto, and cling to his wife. V'hayu levasar echad, and they shall become one flesh. And that's what we're going to look at right now. So we've already looked at a few of these. We had read about the fact that it had to do with moral behavior and forbidding consanguineous behavior, etc. It also was talking about that it should be male, female, etc. We talked about that aspect of things, but we're going to get into something else here. Well, dive right into it. V'davak be'ishto, right? And cling with his wife, right? Or in his wife. Stick, literally, davak means to glue or to stick. Cling in his wife. Be can mean with. It can also mean in. Amar Rava, okay? Rava, he's a great Amora, a scholar. He says here, Ben Noach, meaning literally a son of Noah, meaning a non-Jew. That's what a Ben Noach is. Sheba al Eshet Chavayro, who has intimate relationships with his neighbor's wife, with his fellow's wife. Shelor Kedarka. Shelor Kedarka means not in the normal way. That's literally means not in her way. Patur is exempt. So what generally, and you notice the note I've made up there, generally shalok kedarka is a euphemistic way of referring to anal relations, but it means not in the normal way of sexual relations. So possibly it could include other things, but generally it's understood as anal. Dichtiv, I told you this was R-rated. Dichtiv, and how does he know it? V'davak be'ishto, it says, and he shall cling to his wife, be'ishto, so in other words, with his wife, v'lo be'eshet chavayro, so this is saying that it's referring to saying that that he has to have normal relations, essentially is what it's going to say, with his wife. And it doesn't, this law, he's saying, doesn't refer to his neighbor's wife. That's how he's understanding it. And Torah Tamima is going to have plenty to say about that. V'davak, and again, it says, and cling to, so understood to mean having intimate relations in the normal way. V'lo shelugdaka. So it doesn't refer to that if it isn't in the normal way. So, wow, right? Right. Mm. Remember, never, don't ever assume that we understand everything. This is just a process, and we'll see. It really has to go through this, but it goes through a process of trying to have a deeper understanding of what's going on. Here we go. Drasha mehufechet. He says this interpretation, mehufach, lehafoch, means to turn over. Miresha filsefa, from beginning to end. And I struggled with this particular expression here. And I believe it's saying that what it's doing is it's inferring the opposite from, that's what it's saying, is that it is the opposite of what is being stated positively. Klomar, that is to say, Daha da'asar hakatuv eshit chaveiro, that since the scripture has forbidden his neighbor's, his fellow's wife, kededarshinan, as we've already explained in our previous understandings, beishtor, so it says beishtor because it says his wife, velo be'eshit chavaro. In other words, he should cling to his wife and not to his neighbor's wife. Hurak bedevek dahainu kidarka. In other words, that verse only is referring to davek, and they're understanding davek as meaning normal sexual relations. Dahainu kidarka, and that's the kedarka in her normal way. Aval belo vidavak, but if we're not talking about the application of this word vidavak, which is, in other words, they're saying that this term vedavak is being limited to ishto, and dorshtin beishto. We do not say that that applies only to his wife. The law be'eshet chavaro, it doesn't apply to his fellow's wife. So I hope you're understanding the logic of how this is being understood legally. The omnam, however, zehu rak be'eshet ben Noach. This only applies to the wife of a non-Jew, in other words, a non-Jewish wife, woman. Aval imba al eshet Yisrael, but if he happens to have intimate relationships with a Jewish woman, right, an Israelite woman, chayav, he is going to be guilty. Afilu shelo ka, even in a situation where it is not normal intercourse. He is going to be chayav. And generally speaking, we know that adultery is a capital offense. The Iyen Bekesef Mishneh, he says you can look further on in Kesef Mishneh. Kesef Mishneh is a commentary on Maimonides' encyclopedic work on Jewish law. Perik Tet, chapter 9, Halacha Zayin. Those chapters are subdivided into halachot. Himlachim, and this section is called Malachim, Laws of Kings. And generally, that section of the Maimonides Mishneh Torah is dealing with, let's say, universal laws, laws that deal with both Jews and non-Jews, but especially with non-Jews. V'chein ein ze rak be'eshet chavera. And likewise, this doesn't just apply, ein ze, sorry, ein ze, this rak be'eshet chavaro, this applies only to his fellow's wife, meaning that it's this idea of being patur, exempt for having anal intercourse, applies only to his wife, to his friend's wife, to his fellow's wife. Aval be'ishto, right? Okay. aval beishto, but with regard to his own wife, this is again talking about a Jewish person, patur, he is exempt al shelo kedarka. He is exempt if he has another anal intercourse with his wife, is basically what this is saying. Now, I would like to say that Jewish law is being very progressive in the sense that if for some reason the two of them enjoy intercourse in that particular way, there is no prohibition against it. But this is just as far as we've gotten now, okay? We'll see. So, in other words, what this is suggesting is that a Jewish man is not allowed to have any kind of intercourse with a person, someone else's wife, okay? But he's allowed to have anal intercourse with his own wife. But in what we've just read, on the basis of this, a non-Jew is allowed to have anal intercourse. At least I wouldn't say he's allowed to. Let's say he's exempt. We've got to be careful about that with a woman who's his friend's, his fellow's wife, but he's not allowed to have that kind of intercourse with his own wife, right? So we're in a situation now, and we're going to see, he's going to comment about this because this is bizarre. In other words, that a Jew is allowed to do something that a non-Jew isn't allowed to do. Af al pi diktiv, and despite the fact that it states v'davak, it uses this term v'davak to cling, v'darshinan shvelo shelo kedarka, and we have expounded that to mean it means in the normal way and not in the non-normal way. Ach klala klaimalan, right? However, we have a general rule. In other words, we've explained this. This is the way we explain this to allow a non-Jewish person to have this kind of intercourse, and they're forbidden for having it with their own wife. Klala klaimala, but we have an established general principle, the leka midi de Israel share, that there's never a situation where there is something that an Israelite is allowed to do, le'oved elilim asur, while a non-Jew is not allowed to do it. It's a general rule. So the idea of an Israelite being allowed to practice this and a non-Jewish person not allowed to practice this kind of intercourse, it doesn't work. Uli Israel share shelo kedarka, and to say that for an Israelite it is permissible for him and his wife to engage in this kind of intercourse. Kedamashma b'Nedarim Kaf Bet, as we learn in Nedarim, we know, in other words, we're saying that it is absolutely permissible for a Jewish couple to engage in this kind of intercourse, as is implied in Nedarim Kaf Bet BT. I looked up this reference, and this is in Nedarim, Tractate Nedarim, page 20b, where one of the rabbis is talking to a woman who is, and I'm sorry to say this, she is actually saying, I'm just doing this to be transparent, who's coming to him and saying, here, I'm willing to have intercourse with him, but he wants to have intercourse with me anally. And he says, what can I say to her? BT, my daughter, HaTorah hitiratcha, sorry, made you permissible. The Torah made you permissible. I cannot imagine, right, a decent marital relationship where there isn't consensual intercourse. But it's there, and I have to deal with it, and I'm sharing it with you, and I don't think that this is something that really can happen or should be happening, despite this fact. Now, again, I could tell you we have to deal with other cultures, and we don't necessarily understand fully how other cultures are necessarily operating, or back then, or however. I would say nowadays, uh-uh, it has to be consensual. But at least the idea of alternative forms of intercourse being permissible is an interesting situation. Going on, going on. So, let me see if this, okay. So we've finished this particular section here. It doesn't end there. Okay, so here we go. Davak beishto. And again, look at this. I mean, we're really trying to deal with these words and drilling down as to what they express. Tanya. So this is saying this is an earlier source. Rava is a later source. That is a Talmudic source, otherwise known as Amoraic. Tanya means that it is a Tanaitic source, and the Tanaim are sages that preceded the Amoraim. Rava is an Amora. Tanya refers to some source that is earlier, that's Tanaitic. And here we go. Ben Noach Sheba Bi'a Asura, a non-Jew, right, who engages in a forbidden form of intercourse, ha'ara'ah. But ha'ara'ah is a word that's used for incomplete intercourse, right? It's just the beginning, the first stages of intercourse, of physical intercourse. Chayav is going to be guilty. Shneimar, as it states, v'davak be'ishto, as it says again, he shall cling to his wife, v'lo be'eshet chaveiro, he shouldn't be doing this with his fellow's wife. And here we go, v'davak, and because it says cling, davak kol shemhu, meaning any kind of part of any kind of intercourse whatsoever. Kol shehu means anything of any kind. Going on, let's take a look. Gam drasha zo nidreshet meresha l'sefa. He says again, this particular interpretation is a similar kind of stating the negative from the positive or the positive from the negative. It's that kind of interpretation. Kidrasha hakodema, just like the previous interpretation that we just read. Kamosha katavnu kam, just as sham, just as we wrote there. And what this is trying to say is, v'lo be'eshet chavero, that he's not allowed to engage with his fellow's wife, bedevek kol shehu, in any kind of intercourse whatsoever, any kind of sexual engagement. Umevo'ar lefizo, and for this reason, it becomes clarified, the Oved Kochavim, that a non-Jew, literally it means an idolater, but it means we could say an idolater. I will say parenthetically, I think there are plenty of non-Jews who in many ways act more Jewishly than some Jews. So anyway, we could look at this as idolater. Koneh et ishto b'hara. That we can say then that a non-Jew is able to acquire, literally it means he acquires his wife through this initial stage of intercourse. In other words, we know that there's something that's called a common law marriage, where basically a man says to a woman, I think an example of it would be, he says to her, listen, if we engage in intercourse, you should understand that that act is a formal act of marriage to you. I'm formally betrothing myself to you. So he's saying here, even if it's not a complete act of intercourse, he in fact is able to get married that way. De kamok de darshinan, because it's just as we are interpreting davak kol shehu, right? That just as we explained davak, this word davak, kol shehu, any kind of sexual engagement, the isur, to prohibit it. In other words, we had said that a non-Jew engages in that is going to be guilty. Kach nidrash gam leheter. We're going to interpret it also for permissible things, for permission, le'inyan ishto, with regard to his wife. V'davak be'ishto, it says, and he clings to his wife, afilu devek kol shehu, even if it's just the very initial stages of intercourse, of clinging. Uvikar hadrash, right? And the I would say the essence of this drush, of this interpretation, to halashon devek, it has to do with the fact that the word davak, right? This word davak, to cling, more al kol shehu, it refers to any kind of clinging, any kind of cleaving to something. And the reason we understand the connotation of davak as meaning it's not a super glue kind of clinging, it appears disfara le kamandamar, that the person who's the author of this interpretation holds kamandamar, like the person who says babavli. It says in the in the Talmud, Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Sanhedrin Samach Daled, Sanhedrin page 64a. The Darish Hanitzmadim, there's a verse that talks in Deuteronomy that says those who clinged to, how do I say it, right? Who clinged to Baal Peor. And this is referring to an item in Numbers, an occurrence that happened in Numbers after Balak and Bilam, after Bilam tried to curse them, how the Israelite men were seduced by the Moabite women, and they were killed. Right. So, in other words, because what happened was that in order to engage with those women, they had to bow down to their idol. Right? So nitzmadim, they're saying the word semed, which also means to cling, kitsamid pitil. We're talking here about like the tzamid pitil means a closely fitting lid. In other words, very closely attached. Klomar chibur chazak umamitz. We're talking about a super strong kind of clinging. Va'atem hadvekim, but those of you who were davek b'Hashem, who even if your connection to God is only a loose kind of connection, and there it says, goes on to say, Chayim kulchem hayom, you are alive today. Meaning that on the one hand, when it came to idolatry, they had to be really, really committed to that idolatry. But even if their relationship to God was somewhat light, they still are alive. Kishte to sorry, tamarot. We're talking, and they're in that drush in Sanhedrin. They say like two dates advukot ze like two dates sticking to each other, because dates are sticky, and that's the kind of stickiness we're talking about. We're talking about a sticky note kind of sticky. Klomar devikal. In other words, we're talking about a very light kind of connection. And let's go on. Udechavtea, right? And similarly, lo bezachar, in other words, we're saying this kind of ara'ah, right? This very initial stages of intercourse, the laws apply also to a male, velo bebhema, and they also apply to an animal, afilu koshahu. Any kind of sexual engagement is forbidden, period. So let's go on here. And again, the fact that it's talking about these kinds of things is because we know about human nature and that human beings engage in these kinds of things. So let me find the place here. Right. The ikar isur znut behema v'chaya, and regarding the nature or the very essence of the prohibition of having any kind of immoral behavior with an animal or a wild beast, mevu'ah b'drasha hasamba samuch, will be explained in the next drush, which we will leave for next time. So I'm going to here, okay, right here. And I'm going to stop the share. And I see you're still with me, so I'm glad about that. Any comments before I get off the recording? Any thoughts? All right. We'll allow you to comment off the record.